Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Magnus Aronsson, and I'm the Managing Director of ESBRI. The subject of today's webinar is Using Imagination to Make Uncertain Things Happen. The topic clearly resonates. Close to 350 people have registered. The majority comes from the private sector, but we are also joined by participants from the public sector, academia, and politics. They are from Africa, Asia, Europe, and America, in total 19 countries. Before I hand over the screen to Professor Amar Bidea, just a few housekeeping notes. Amar will answer questions after his presentation. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the presentation slides will later be available on ESBRI Play on our website esbri.se. You will of course receive an email once the material is available. To set today's presentation and Amar Bidea's book in context, I would like to share a quote from Professor Richard Freiberg, the Jacob Wallenberg Professor of Economics at the Stockholm School of Economics, and is also member of the committee for the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in member of Alfred Nobel. The quote comes from an article he wrote in Critical Review, which published a special issue focusing on Amar's book. By this investigation of our understanding of entrepreneurship, how it's financed and supported, is intertwined with our understanding of uncertainty. By this, Uncertain Enterprise is a work of breathtaking breadth, with insights relevant for economics and across the social sciences more generally. I can think of no better overview of the concept of uncertainty, and this will be my recommended introduction for anyone interested in applying the concept. With that, Amar, the screen is yours.
I had a jacket on, which I took off because it is too warm. It is actually minus 12 degrees centigrade in Cambridge today. In any case, thank you, Magnus, for organizing this seminar. As always, it is a pleasure to speak at ESBRI events. Thank you, Richard Freiberg, for your very generous comments about my book. May I strongly recommend Richard's essay. It goes far beyond merely reviewing my book. Also, it is open source and free. As you can see, it's a heavy book, nearly 1 kilogram. It has 40 pages of references and notes. Richard's kind words pertain to the first third, which is my eccentric intellectual history of uncertainty. Since 3/4 of you who are attending the seminar aren't academics, I will skip over this part. I will exclude all the citations and references. I'll refer to just 5 scholars, all deceased. And I will start with a little, if ancient, introductory joke. One should always start with a joke, I'm told. So the joke is a 17th century joke from Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, Molière. Molière is also dead. And Monsieur Jourdain has retained the philosophy master to sort of upgrade his intellectual and social standing. And the philosophy master tells Monsieur Jourdain there's nothing but prose and or verse. And Monsieur Jourdain says, really? There's nothing but prose or verse? The philosophy master says, no, sir, everything that is not prose is verse, and everything that is not verse is prose. Monsieur Jourdain, by my faith, for more than 40 years, I've been speaking prose without knowing anything about it. And I'm much obliged to you for having taught me that. So I'm here to tell you that for most of your lives, most of you have been behaving reasonably with respect to uncertainty, and you may be relieved or you may feel cheated. That is up to you. But more seriously, I want to ask you the question, why does prose, and especially imaginative prose, continue to so dominate our intercourse? First of all, speaking in iambic pentameter would be inconvenient. Indian mathematicians in the 7th century had to frame their proofs in verse. Modern mathematicians have figured out that symbols are more convenient. It's much more efficient. And indeed, symbolic representation and numerical representation dominates discourse in many academic fields, particularly in economics and, of course, in mathematics. But curiously, symbolic representation does not dominate U.S. Supreme Court arguments and judgments. U.S. Supreme Court's arguments and judgments are almost entirely in prose, and it's an imaginative kind of prose. It includes figures of speech, similes, metaphors, and analogies, and even literary allusions. Uh, Ambiguous figurative expression continues to rule in not just in literature or in the creative arts, but also in many what one would call practical domains. Why is that? So, human communication, going back to prehistory, has not merely communicated information, it has also communicated evocative ideas. This is art from the Stone Age, Neanderthal man going back about 60,000 years. And it continues to this day. Why is this so? In a nutshell, I'll argue that there's an enduring practical value to evocative expression. It reflects the imperative of imaginative discourse, which produces the confidence to cooperate by combining observed evidence with imagined possibilities. So, paradoxically, when we are faced with uncertain possibilities, it is imprecise give and take that resolves disagreements. And we're not, I want to talk mainly about common everyday uncertainties. I do not want to talk about unknown unknowns. I want to talk about uncertainties which we care about and which are more or less tangible. And these are produced by known to be missing information, stuff which we do not know, or what technically may sometimes be called ambiguity. Like I said, I do not want to get into this arcane domain of unknown unknowns or radical uncertainties. The outline of my talk is I'm going to start out briefly providing some definitions, correlates, and distinctions between uncertainty, because what are we talking about? Then I will talk about how imaginative discourse helps us cope individually and, more importantly, collectively with uncertainty. And then I will talk about the role of routinized discourse. We hate routines, but I will argue that routinized imaginative discourse is essential to our coping with uncertainty. So let me start out with a simple definition. There's a technical definition of uncertainty, which, since most of you are not academics, I'll skip over. I will stick to the ordinary language and meaning and associations of uncertainty. In ordinary language, we refer to uncertainty either as a mental state, which we might simply call doubt, or as an external situation. The mental state of, damn it, what is Trump going to do today is a question, is an internal mental state. What Trump actually does outside is a situation of doubt. As I said, I'm concerned with doubts that we are actually aware of. I'm going to exclude doubts which are inchoate and which we care about. And these two kinds of doubts, this mental state of doubt and this external situation, are linked by known to be missing information. So if we know that some information is missing, that creates doubt. And to my argument, it really isn't important whether we are talking about the internal mental state or the external situation. These two things can be used synonymously. This mental state has some desirable and undesirable correlates. Instead of talking about doubt or uncertainty, we can talk in the positive sense about wonder, curiosity, or excitement. These are the positive correlates of doubt. Or we can talk about fear, anxiety, or nervousness. These are sort of the negative correlates of doubt. These two correlates and the missing information create internal and interpersonal conflicts. The same situation may evoke a sense of adventure, a sense of what I've called venturesomeness, or it can also create a morbid craving craving for uncertainty. And these doubts may be just within ourselves, or they may be within a group. So I may be gung-ho, ready to go. You may be saying, I'm not so sure, I'm concerned things could go wrong, or vice versa. Uh, a third and critical aspect of uncertainty is imagination. Frequently, since information is incomplete, we have to imagine something about the state we do not know about. We have to imagine how we might get from where we are today to where we might want to go. We use imagination may even be the source of our doubts, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to distinguish between imagination, which is a human capacity, and random hallucinations, which are produced by LLM. So these are two very different things. I said we're going to be talking about tangible targets of doubt, not unknown unknowns. But even within these tangible targets, there are many distinctions and varieties. Some doubts are self-evident. My car has broken down. Why has it broken down? That's a doubt. Or these can be imaginatively perceived. I mean, a lot of medical innovations which I study start out with some doubt about something which shouldn't be. So the cure for ulcer started out with a pathologist in Australia saying, why do I see these squiggly things in my microscope? That's a doubt. And no doubt, thousands of pathologists may have seen this before, but it never occurred to them to ask, why am I seeing this? So the doubts can be in your face, pushing at you, or they may be sourced in imaginations. There are many motivations for targeting. The concerns for caring about. These could be utilitarian. These could be a sense of adventure. These could be fame and fortune. I don't really care. Well, what I really want to emphasize today is a distinction between one-off and distributional targets of uncertainty. By that, I mean doubts about a specific instance versus multiple instances, doubts about a statistical distribution or doubts about a specific exemplar. So what is the temperature today or tomorrow is a doubt about a specific instance. What will the average temperature be in winter is a doubt about a distribution. Whether Swedes are more honest than Italians is a distributional doubt. Whether Lars is more honest than Giuseppe is a specific doubt. Uh, these kinds of doubts will tend to affect both individual and collective choice. And these doubts will arise because of difference. And how we address individual and collective choice will depend on the kinds of doubts we are dealing with. So there are basic differences in the kinds of evidence that we use and in the modes of reasoning that we use when we are talking about specific instances and when we are talking about when we're talking about distributions, distributional uncertainty. So let me take two extreme examples, two archetypal examples. One is the drug trial and the other is the criminal trial. In a drug trial, the target of uncertainty or doubt is distribution, whether the drug is on average efficacious and safe. In the case of a criminal trial, we're concerned with a one-off. We're concerned with the guilt of a particular subject. And so the kinds of evidence whose presence or absence increases or reduces doubt is different in these two kinds of targets. In a drug trial, for example, there's high doubt in what's known as a phase 1 trial. When a phase 1 trial has maybe done on 5 or 6 subjects, you just look at the treatment, there's no placebo data. In a phase 3 trial, you use statistics where you have a control group, we have a treated group, we have a large treatment group, maybe thousands of people, then you give the others a placebo, And what we really, and the core of the distinction between whether the drug is efficacious or not, whether we have confidence in its efficacy or not, depends on statistics. In in the criminal trial, we rely not on many observations of the same kind of data. We drawn from a broad distribution. We rely principally on contextual evidence. What happened in that particular case? Is there a CCTV? Is there a CCTV recording? Did we find a murder weapon? What does the DNA evidence look like? What does the blood test look like? Did anybody hear an argument between between the accused and the victim? Did anybody see anything going on? Are there fingerprints? Uh, did the accused stand to benefit from a will if he bumped off the victim? Are there footsteps? And so it's disparate evidence, and it's not just having tons of fingerprints. The more disparate evidence there is, the more contextual evidence there is, the more confidence you have whether someone is guilty of a crime or not. You need to convict, to remove reasonable doubt in a criminal trial. We rely on a range of evidence, all of which has to reinforce each other. In a drug trial, we rely on a particular, on a large statistical database of efficacy and treatment. In addition to the kinds of evidence in doubts about one-offs and doubts about distributions, there are differences in modes of reasoning. Here I'm going to rely on Jerome Bruner's contrasts. Jerome Bruner is the hero of the third part of my book, and I'm going to have to very, very briefly summarize what he says. And Bruner makes a distinction between what he calls logico-scientific and narrative mode reasoning. And Bruner makes a distinction on the one side between math and the natural sciences as extreme cases of logico-scientific thinking, and great literature as an extreme example of narrative mode reasoning. And he says that the logico-scientific mode deals in general causes with higher and higher reaching for abstraction. The narrative mode, exemplified by literature, deals in human or human-like intention and action, and the particulars of experience, which it locates in time and place. He says that both good stories and well-formed logical arguments can be used as means for convincing another. Yet what they convince of is fundamentally different. Logical arguments convince one of their truth. Stories convince of their lifelikeness. Scientists may invent facts and worlds, but their world-making must eventuate in predicting something that is testably right, however much it may speculate. Stories have no such need for testability. Believability in a story is of a different order than the believability in the most speculative parts of a physical theory. I would argue that in one-offs, we're really relying much more heavily on narrative mode reasoning, and we're relying on contextual evidence. I've given you sort of two extreme examples, drug trials and a murder trial. Typically, you have a choice between whether you treat a question or an uncertainty as an uncertainty about a specific instance or an uncertainty about a distribution. And there are extreme cases, of course, and we emphasize one or the other. Let me first of all admit that there are serious limitations to one-off framings and treatments. Treating something as a distribution is much faster, it's much quicker, it's much less expensive. Looking at context versus statistics can introduce favoritism and bias. If you're running an organization, it leads to the loss of centralized authority. And so many organizations, many societies tend to favor treating questions as a distributional question. And in banking, for example, Handelsbanken, which I've written a case history about, is an exception. Handelsbanken hates tick box lending. They treat each borrower as an individual case. SE-Banken and other banks, particularly in commercial lending, look at models. And Handelsbanken is an exception, which is why I wrote a case about it. In academia, particularly in the social sciences, there's a very strong emphasis on distributional uncertainties and a disdain for one-off targets of uncertainty. One-off targets are considered to be lower status. If you explain what happens or what might happen in a particular case, you're not considered to be a serious scientist. You're supposed to explain what happened in the general instance. And if you rely on what I call narrative mode reasoning and contextual data, you're told, oh, you're just generalizing from anecdote and you're just telling just so stories. But the reality is that the statistical methods can only resolve one-off uncertainties by denying their one-offness. I should say when I should not condemn all academics for favoring statistical distributions. The scientists, academics in the humanities, historians, literary academics do look at uncertainties about one-offs. Legal scholars in particular are especially interested in one-offs. And there's this famous blue bus case which illustrates. So the blue bus case is an actual case taught in countless law school classes. It's a real case tried in 1947 in Massachusetts. And the facts of the case are there's a car driving at night. It gets hit by a bus, suffers damage. The bus speeds off. The driver of the car sues, but he hasn't actually seen who hit him. But he sues the blue bus company on the grounds that the blue bus operates 70% of the buses in that territory. And in a civil trial, the standard is preponderance of evidence. And what does preponderance of evidence mean? Preponderance of evidence is often taken to mean a probability of greater than 50%. Well, if the blue bus company is running 70% of the buses, then there must be a 70% probability that the blue bus company was responsible for the damage. And the judge said this is completely ridiculous. You cannot rely on bald facts, on bald statistics to resolve issues of specific instances. This case went to appeal, and the Massachusetts Supreme Court affirmed that this is indeed ridiculous. So it is not in the real world the case that one could or should always rely on statistics, however much our academic friends may tell us, however much the social scientists may tell us, follow the evidence, by which they typically mean follow the statistical evidence. In the real world, we often can and should be relying on contextual evidence to rely on uncertainties. So let me turn to my second topic, which is the role of imaginative discourse in resolving these contextual uncertainties. And I start with a quote from Frank Knight. Frank Knight is the hero of my book, 1921, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. And in the book, he writes, "The existence of a problem of knowledge depends on the future being different from the past, while the possibility of the solution to the problem depends on the future being like the past." He further goes on to say that the problems of life, or of conduct at least, arise from the fact that we know so little about the future. The essence of the situation is action according to opinion, of greater or less foundation and value. Neither entire ignorance, not radical incidents, nor complete or perfect information, but partial knowledge. Now, what is the practical problem with action based on opinion? A significant problem based on action according to opinion is that it leads to honest disagreements about interpretations. When we do not know what is going to happen in the future, or even what is behind the curtain about today, we rely, as I said, on imaginative interpretations. And these interpretations can be different. So we can end up with honest disagreements about what we believe. And these disagreements can be amplified by the feelings that are evoked when we do not have complete information. The incomplete information, the uncertainty may evoke anxiety in me. It may invoke a sense of adventure in you. Uh, and the practical problem is that if we can act entirely on our own, uh, that'd be fine. We just would do what we want. But in a great many cases, the limitations of our resources and the limitations of our authority limit unilateral action. So we have to somehow align our imaginations. We have to somehow align our opinions. And I argue in 4 chapters of my book that what I call groundedly imaginative discourse overcomes the impossibility of objective scientific resolutions. Like I said, objective scientific resolutions are impossible, particularly in one-offs. They're even very difficult, actually, in distributional questions, but they're particularly impossible in entrepreneurial situations. And therefore, we rely on groundedly imaginative. What do I mean by groundedly imaginative? I mean things which have some basis in fact. So this is not pure imagination, but there is an imaginative process, a human process, by we imagine where we might end up and how we might end up there. So let's unpack a little bit what this imaginative discourse entails. What are, let's call it, the fruits or the ends of discourse? First off, our discourse, if you want to persuade other people, is we have to get their attention or interest. I may have the best argument in the world, but if nobody pays attention, if nobody buys my book, well, it doesn't matter. You may have perfect foresight about what is going to happen with the stock market or what is going to happen with Trump, but if nobody pays attention, who cares? So attention and interest is a prerequisite for effective discourse. Second, people have to understand what you have to say. And since you are relying on imagination, you have to frequently communicate. You have to things which you cannot fully tell. And somehow you have to you have to get people to understand what is in your mind and what you cannot actually put down in numbers or in algebraic symbols. Your path or destination has to be plausible. It cannot be absolutely certain that you'll get there, but you have to, depending on the circumstances, make a plausible case that your story is more or your narrative is more or less correct. And frequently, one of the ends of discourse tends to be the securing of feedback, which will actually improve your imagination, sharpen your views about where you want to get to and how. Getting to the means of discourse. One obvious means of discourse is enactment. And I mean, Steve Jobs was the master of enactment. If you haven't seen Jobs's presentations of the iPhone or the iPad, I strongly recommend it. It's an hour well spent. And this kind of enactment is dramatic. But equally, and when I used to teach entrepreneurship, this is what I used to tell my students: when you want to sell something to someone, something to someone who's not quite sure what you have to sell is worth buying, you have to sense and respond to what the other person is saying. So the enactment is not just a broadcast; it's a dialogue. You have to inevitably rely on what I call evocative devices. You have to use metaphors and analogies. If you were to say, I have this business model in mind, it really helps to say, my business model is like this. I am the Uber of dog food, I am the Airbnb of food delivery. And you don't have to be, and people say, aha, I kind of know what Uber is. I kind of know what Airbnb is. And therefore, your imagination of what your proposal is, I understand. And frequently and increasingly, our evocative devices use multimedia. And I used to disdain when I wrote my books to have anything other than plain text. This book, which I now has plenty of pictures in it. I use bullet points because I said, what the hell? If your goal is to convince people, why not use all the tools that modern technology has provided to get your ideas across? The third and somewhat counterintuitive aspect of persuasive discourse, even in the practical domain, is providing imagined details. Why? Because they create plausibility. Uh, if you watch historical dramas, if you watch docudramas of, say, the Civil War, people go to enormous trouble to get costumes which are period costumes, which look exactly like what people used to dress like before. And then, when you do a street scene, people go to an enormous trouble to stage the scene so that it actually looks like a street scene. And the question is, why do people go to so much trouble and expense? And the argument is that, yes, we know it's a docudrama. Yes, we know it's fiction, but it somehow seems more plausible if there are data in it. Similarly with spreadsheets, all of us have suffered through spreadsheets. Our spreadsheets have thousands of cells in it. We all know, or at least reasonable people know, that most of the numbers in the spreadsheet are made up. But yet, if we do not have a spreadsheet, if we do not have this highly detailed model of how the business is going to unfold, people don't take you seriously. Because having the spreadsheet, even if people don't believe that what is going to happen even remotely comes close to what is in your spreadsheet, it shows that you're serious about what you're going to do. It also shows that if you have some expertise in the topic that you're writing about. So if your spreadsheet says my salespeople are going to make 5 sales calls a day, that means that you kind of know how many sales calls a salesperson can make. If your spreadsheet shows that you're going to make 500 sales calls a day, you do not know what's going to happen. The third reason for providing imaginative details, and this is actually suggested to me by a 20-year-old who I was sharing my book with, is that it demonstrates creativity. When you're proposing going down an imagined path, everybody knows that there will be unforeseen problems. And the question they want to know at that time is, will you be creative enough? Will you be resourceful enough to work around that problem which we do not know what it is right now? And the fact that you've shown creativity in constructing a scenario now provides at least some evidence that you will be able to work around it. So that's why I say, sort of, when we are dealing with the unknown, with the half known, when we're dealing with imagined futures, you have to provide imagined details to be taken seriously. Finally, we also rely on stories and parables, and I think that fewer stories and parables than people talk about. I have a chapter in my book. Read it if you wish. I don't want to belabor it. Yeah, or we can have some. We can address it in Q&A. You might think that this kind of storytelling, narrative mode discourse is just basically a con job aimed at gullible targets. No, serious people want to hear narrative mode reasoning. This is from an unprompted Amazon review of my book by a venture capitalist veteran who I happen to know. And he says a great talent for an entrepreneur is the ability to imagine a successful outcome and be able to describe that outcome to providers of capital and prospective employees and to prospective customers. Each of these audiences must find the story compelling for progress to occur. They will not be lured by false precision. Everybody knows that most young enterprises do not succeed, but people are lured by the quality of stories, and in that sense, participate in the act of imagination themselves. Third topic, which is also a little bit counterintuitive, is the role of routinization of imaginative discourse. You might say, if it's imaginative, how can it be routine? Well, in fact, a lot of imagination is placed in routine. So in literature, you have genre conventions. And this, from one definition of a genre conventions are the specific elements, themes, and characteristics found within a particular genre. They help audiences quickly identify the genre and set expectations for the narrative style. Over time, these conventions become recognized standards for the genre. So detective fiction stories are centered on a detective, either professional or amateur, solving a mystery or a crime, often with surprise twists. Similarly, science fiction. So if you pick up a mystery novel at some subconscious level, you want that novel to convey to the routine, the convention of a genre. If you go to see a rom-com movie, there are conventions to a rom-com movie which, if you don't conform to, the audience gets disturbed. These are not set in stone, but they are more or less stable. Similarly, in practical domains, there are routines and conventions. These set the expectations and rules for the discourses. They determine the extent of groundedness and plausibility. They determine the strictness of the scrutiny of your narrative. They determine the role of peers, bosses, and outsiders, and their variance and the factors which affect the reasonable strictness and multi-party oversight depend on the stakes and spillovers. So, for example, as I showed you in a murder trial, the strictness of the narrative presented by the prosecution is extremely strict, because you are going to either sentence people to life in prison, or you're going to let a person off scot-free. If you are going to diagnose a life-threatening disease like cancer, you want very strict scrutiny of the evidence. If you're going to diagnose a cold, you just sort of look at the person and say, you're sneezing, fine, we're not going to do an RNA test. Strictness and routines depend on the complexity, how much specialized knowledge and effort is required in making whatever it is that you want to happen. So, for example, if you're planning the invasion of Normandy, there's going to be a very tough scrutiny of your plans for the invasion. And it depends on the uniqueness. So if what you're doing is highly unique, there's only so much evidence that you can have. And these factors vary from domain to domain, but since my principal domain has historically been entrepreneurship and it's now medical innovation, let me talk about commercial innovation. So in commercial initiatives, the routines which you use to evaluate commercial initiatives depend, on the one hand, on the uncertainty and complexity of the resources required, and on the other hand, on the funding resources. And all three of these things go together. So the funding resources will determine the uncertainty, complexity, and resources required. They will determine the routines determine the funding resources. So let me show you a little map. And this is a map which I've been using in my book going back to 2000, but it hasn't changed very much. So in the upper left-hand corner, you have self or informally financed enterprises. Think of Microsoft, Bill Gates and Paul Allen starting Microsoft in 1975. You really have no clue about where the internet is going to go. On the bottom right-hand corner, you have public company projects like Microsoft's launch of Office 365. And what you see corresponding to this on the upper left-hand corner, this basically the investment required is tiny. It's self-financed. And there are no strict routines. People, Gates and Allen talk to each other and say, hey, is this a good idea? Yeah, it's a good idea. Let's go. With Microsoft and Office 365, there are very strict routines. And in between, you have angel-backed investments where there's slightly less uncertainty, a little more uh, oversight. In VC-backed enterprises, there's considerably more routine, considerably less uncertainty. But let me point to something in the bottom right-hand corner. It is not, I mean, people always say, oh, public companies are so damn bureaucratic, their routines make it impossible for them to do anything. This is not the case. Public companies play a critical role in modern innovation. The Mag 7 are large public companies. They have been spearheading the investment in IT. And the interesting thing over here is that they make huge investments. Their routines are strict, but the tolerance for uncertainty is not zero. It cannot be zero. If you had zero tolerance for uncertainty, there would be no progress. No investment would ever be made. So these are not Weberian routines where there is no subjectivity. In large public companies, yes, there's a routine, but there's also subjectivity. I write cases on medical innovation now. Pharmaceutical companies are amongst the most bureaucratic and regulated companies you will find. But even there, who the product champion is, what that product champion's opinions are, and how successfully that person uh, uh, advances his or her ideas does make a difference. So it is still a human enterprise. Now you may ask, what about the upper right-hand corner? I argue that the upper right-hand corner in this entrepreneurial ecosystem is and should be an empty space. That space is occupied only in exceptional cases. So if you have a highly charismatic or highly wealthy entrepreneur, uh, like Elon Musk, who can found Tesla, who can found SpaceX, that's where you may find investments which are huge and where the strictness of the routine is relatively low. The upper right-hand corner is also, unfortunately, occasionally occupied in times of mania. And again, we can get to this in the discussion. I believe we are in a mania now, and that's all bets are off, all routines are off. Let me skip this since we're running out of time. So let me make a few concluding comments. There's an ancient scholarly prejudice against studying one-offs. It goes back to Aristotle. And Aristotle says there can only be knowledge of the universal and the necessary. What is individual and what is contingent cannot be an object of knowledge. Action based on practical wisdom must also recognize the particulars, for it is practical and practice is concerned with particulars. That is why someone who do not know, and especially those who have experience, are more practical than who know. Practical wisdom engages with the individual, but can only do so in blindness. There can be no science of the individual. It has gotten worse. Practical wisdom of the Aristotle's blind practitioners disdained by modern experts. They tell us, follow the science, follow the evidence. And what they basically mean, follow the statistics. There's a dysfunctional disregard for contextual differences. There blind bets on historical patterns like Bertrand Russell's inductivist turkey. That's a great story. The inductivist turkey is a turkey who gets fed every morning like clockwork at 8 o'clock. And the inductivist turkey says, if it's 8 o'clock, I get fed. And this is a perfect rule until Christmas when the turkey gets slaughtered. And I believe modern science has come to behave in many cases like the inductivist turkey. Let me skip this. Let me skip this as well. And let me leave you, because there are only 9 more minutes, with some practical cautions and suggestions. Don't blindly trust trait one-off distributional problems. Beware of statistical extrapolations, large language models included. Demand plausible, comprehensible, contextualized explanations. Don't be cowed by black boxes and well-controlled experiments. It's a decision. Take routines seriously. They must be not too tight, not too loose. They must be stable and predictable and not fossilized. Beware of the capricious go for broken versionary. And finally, I take Will Rogers' advice: never miss a good opportunity to shut up. And that's the end of my slideshow.
Well, thank you very much, Amar, and thank you for a lot of thoughts out of your book. Please ask some questions, and while we're waiting for a few questions, I was thinking about giving your views on imagination and the fact we see now that your book is coincided with the AI boom, and you touched a little bit on that. What is your take on the current tech innovation landscape? Do you think the AI hype cycle is an example of misplaced certainty? And are there unappreciated areas where entrepreneurs should focus instead?
Do we have an hour?
No, well, you have a couple of minutes.
You have a couple of minutes. So this is a subject very close to my heart. And as I was finishing the book, it was rising to the surface. There are two important characters in my book. One is Herbert Simon, who's considered the father of intelligence, of artificial intelligence, and the other is Jerome Bruner, who I just quoted. Both are considered fathers of the cognitive revolution. Herbert Simon thought of the mind as a computer. I mean, and he was also a professor of computer science. Jerome Bruner was a humanist who thought of the world as imagination, who thought of the world as meaning making, determined by history and culture and so forth. And it is my view that whatever the language which may be used, artificial intelligence, and particularly LLMs, are not thinking, they're not reasoning. There's no use of imagination. These are purely statistical models. And these are purely statistical extrapolation. It looks like the model is talking to you. It is not. It's not having a human conversation. It is not having a conversation with you. It is merely extrapolating from what has happened in the past. And these extrapolations can work in two extreme cases. One is in the case of complete fantasy, where where you don't care whether the model hallucinates or not. It's an entertainment. So I could see this being important in entertainment. These extrapolations can also be useful when to use some slightly geeky language when we're talking about stationary phenomena, when we're talking about phenomena having to do with nature. So if you're talking about folding proteins, or if you're talking about playing chess where the rules are fixed, then treating the mind as a computer may work. But when we're talking, as Herbert Simon did, where the past is not a perfect guide to the future, where it is in fact an imperfect guide to the future, you rely on these models absolutely at your peril. I have tried to use LLMs to summarize my books. I think I know what's in my books. There are 5 of them. Every time I get rubbish, I tried to use an LLM to try to generate a talk for me. It produced rubbish. So no, so the use cases are of LLMs and AI. These are not absent. In fact, if we could not be having this conversation without video compression. Video compression is is an example of an LLM. I used this. The cover of this book was used by upscaling an ancient picture, and that was a statistical process. So yeah, it has use cases, but the use cases I don't think are anywhere close to the fantasy that it is going to transform the world. And I think we're in for a really unpleasant surprise when all these massive investments which people are making will implode. Uh, can I go on, or shall we wait for the next
No,
question?
we'll pick up a question here. How would a couple of questions? How would you say this fits into your other work, like Ventures, the book Venturesome Economy and The Call for Judgment? Discrepancies and connections. How to interpret this in a larger context?
So the venturesome economy, uh, again, emphasized the role of imagination, forward-looking imagination, and collectivized imagination. So it basically said that uh, progress requires venturesomeness and broad-based venturesomeness, including the venturesomeness of the user. It is also a collectivized process. And so what this book does, it gets into more detail about how the collectivization of innovation takes place. In terms of call for judgment, this is very much in line with the argument for call for judgment, where I argue that in finance, a great many cases which should be treated as one-off uncertainties, whether someone will repay or not, should not be treated as a statistical problem. They should be treated as a one-off problem, as a contextual problem, which is why I wrote the case on innovation. And it also goes back to my very first book on entrepreneurship, which had a map uh, of the ecosystem of innovation, which showed that there isn't a model for entrepreneurship. There are multiple species, as it were, of innovators. And the relationship and the specialization of the species depends on the kinds of routines and the kind that they follow, and the kinds of uncertainty and the extent of the uncertainty that they're willing to deal with. So this book, in a sense, is a synthesis or a capstone to all my previous books.
Okay, we usually end after as on the setup time, but it still is a great interest in what you're talking about. So we're going to continue for a little while to do. It's always an exception from the rule, and as long as we have some good questions and so forth, and we're going to continue a little bit. So, have you studied the characteristics of innovations in different societies, like China versus USA, in relation to business culture and encouragement of imagination?
Uh, so this is something which has long bothered me. So when I first wrote my first book, I thought that I had found a universal model for entrepreneurship. Then I spent 3 years in Bangalore and realized, oh no, the how entrepreneurship worked in Bangalore is very different because of the legal and regulatory rules in Bangalore. Uh, I I should also say I spent 6 months in Sweden in the early 1980s. I used to work at McKinsey, and uh, my client then was Ericsson, so I used to go to Bromma every day, and it shocked me that if at 5 o'clock every evening everybody would leave. Nobody ever worked over the long weekend, and and then I came back to Sweden 10 years later, and the culture had completely changed. So so I don't, so it's even in I mean, when we talk about differences in culture, we're talking about a distributional uncertainty. But even in distributional uncertainties, these change. And what is the Swedish or the Indian or the Chinese culture today, and uh, how it impacts what people do changes. Having said all that, I'm a firm believer that humans are humans, And the human capacity for imagination and the human capacity for groundedly imaginative discourse is in our blood. It's in our DNA. And I started off with this cave art, which goes back to 60,000 years ago. And this idea of expressing oneself, of imagining things which do not exist and which may wish to exist or we are afraid exist, that's pretty universal. But its actual manifestation in specific changes is influenced by the culture and by the norms. But these norms themselves are changeable in the same way that genre conventions in literature and the movies are changeable.
Okay, and here's another question from the participant. The work of leading people and organizations invariably involves, to borrow your phrasing, aligning the imaginations of an entire group, team, or organization. And you've made a compelling case as to why storytelling matters in domains including entrepreneurship and corporate innovation. As you've used examples referring to figures and institutions in the political domain, such as Trump and the US Supreme Court, I'm wondering what thoughts you might have to share regarding the importance for leaders in domains beyond entrepreneurship and corporate innovation to use narrative mode reasoning and storytelling effectively in their efforts to navigate other kinds of uncertainty. I'm curious, for example, as to what advice you'd give in this moment to the leaders of Denmark and Greenland. Maybe it's a bit out of your, but go ahead.
So, Denmark and Greenland are out of my scope. But as I said, what I currently do is to write and teach cases in medical innovation. So I know something about how persuasion in medical innovation works, and it frequently starts with an imaginative analogy. It almost always includes an imaginative representation of your analogy to other domains. So, I mean, interestingly enough, a lot of analogies in genetics come from information technology. We talk about the genetic code. We talk about signaling. All these are analogies which are taken from information technology. When we talk about why should we try a combination therapy as opposed to a single molecule therapy, we rely on what has happened in the past with respect. I mean, so AIDS was cured by combination therapy, and the combination therapy was inspired by the imagination of the treatment of tuberculosis. So why did even people take seriously in trying combination therapy? It's because someone told them, imaginatively sold them the idea that instead of trying to develop one killer molecule for treating AIDS, why don't we try why don't we try combinations? The law is full of analogies. And it is interesting to read legal judgments. Like I said, they will even even quote literature and say that in War and Peace, so and so said such and such, because they're trying to bring into people's consciousness a state which does not exist. So any condition which is most conditions having to do with human conduct, will involve this, first of all, the individual imagination, what we don't see, and then this imaginative discourse to align our imaginations. And it is hopeless to try to logically deduce what Trump will do. It's not possible. You have to rely on historical examples of what people of that sort have done in the past. And you have to rely on historical analogies of whether resisting people like that is a good idea or whether trying to flatter them is a good idea. I will leave that, since this is not a political talk, I will leave that to the audience to decide. But it's the story of the Second World War. It's the story of Kaiser. I mean, I cannot but look at what is going on with Europe and Trump, except through the ideas, through the eyes of an Indian native. And my imagination goes back to how Indian princes relied on British military rule to protect each other from each other, and what the consequence of that was. Let that be a lesson.
Okay. An additional question here is there is a symbiotic, you talk about at some point the symbiotic relationship between startups and established corporations in fostering innovation. And could you elaborate on how their approaches to uncertainty differ and complement each other? So what can they learn from each other?
So I don't think there is much to be quote unquote learned from each other. I think it is in the 1990s there was a famous article in the Harvard Business Review which said bring Silicon Valley inside, which is sort of it was an exhortation to large companies to behave like entrepreneurs. I think that is nonsense. I think the idea of move fast and break things is a particularly bad idea for large companies which are responsible for scaling up innovations. I do not want a software company that is writing enterprise software, is writing software for aircraft control, to be writing software in the way Gates and Allen wrote software in 1975. The symbiosis comes from the fact that, to the degree that large companies have to focus their initiatives on a few investments where they have a comparative advantage, and where they have, and where I say where they have a comparative advantage is where scale matters and where complexity matters. This leaves open the room for simple initiatives which people don't know where it's going. So Amazon was sort of a case in point. Amazon got started in 1974. People had no idea that e-commerce would be a big thing with the internet. People had no idea what the internet was. And it was these small experiments which Amazon did, which showed that e-commerce could be a thing. But equally, companies like Amazon rely on the infrastructure of large companies, which require huge investments to make it happen. So Amazon had to deliver stuff. And who did it use to deliver stuff? It used the largest, most bureaucratic organization in the world called the US Post Office. And, and also a very large organization called Federal Express. So there's a symbiosis between projects, between those aspects of innovation which require taking chances with things which you do not know. And in biomedical research today, we see that the large pharma companies have a comparative advantage in dealing with phase 3 trials, in dealing with scaling up, and in dealing with commercialization. It's the smaller biotech companies or the individual entrepreneur or the individual scientist sitting in a lab. I mean, where did mRNA start? It did not start with the big pharma companies. It started with a bunch of refugees.
Right. To sum up and to sort of as a final question, anything you come to think about that you missed saying during your presentation that is of essence for people to think about when it comes to dealing with uncertainty and enterprise?
Uh, I guess the only thing is, do not, in this age of science and in this what I think almost think of as for science and for statistics and this great fear that our imaginations and our humanity is going to be overwhelmed by computers and machines. No, it is not. Have confidence. Use your imagination. You will find a way.
Well, with that, thank you very much, Amar, and thank you very much, everybody, for participating. And we will let you know when the recording is available and the slides. So have a good day or evening or morning, wherever you are. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Magnus. Pleasure to have been here. Bye.